thing. So it has practical money generating characteristics already. But this week, let's move on. We're very pleased to have with us Chris Nelder. He's energy analyst and creator and host of the Energy Transition Show podcast. I did capital letters there. Is that correct?
That's great.
So, Chris, I understand you spent 5 years at Rocky Mountain Institute.
Yes.
And you're looking at, with the group, plugging vehicles in, supporting grid services, and the energy policy needed to support those kind of activities, and grid changes that reflect the change to the renewable generation system. But I spotted you have a background in product design and even a spell installing solar photovoltaic systems and so on.
Correct.
Hopefully on the hottest day of the year where you're up on the roof and getting really hot. But also a long history of energy journalism with data and policy in particular.
That's right.
So what surprised me is that Chris's show has been going for 8 years, with the 8th anniversary show, number 207, according to my research.
That's right.
Last month. And you've been interviewing experts trying to provide a new perspective on the energy transition based on factual interchange rather than hype or publicity, shall I say. And whilst my short cycle commute to work doesn't give me the pleasure of listening to podcasts, unfortunately, I must say what I really like about your shows is the geek rating. And I see that the highest ratings among recent episodes, a score of 10, are interviews on regulatory reform and grid architectures. So with a current audience in mind, Chris, what number are you going to give today's talk? I'll leave that to you.
All right. Thank you. How am I doing? Am I on the right camera place here in terms of placement?
We can see you right on.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone. It's a privilege to speak with you here today. As I contemplated what I could possibly say to a group of esteemed researchers and analysts at Oxford University about energy. And as I thought back on our over 200 shows and 8 years of doing this show, what I decided was that I didn't need to tell you anything about energy. Instead, I want to share some thoughts based on my experience and my advocacy for energy transition, not just from interviewing those over 200 experts in the domain of energy, but from the more than a decade prior to that, when I was variously a researcher and an energy journalist and a solar system designer. And there's going to be no slides today because, as the old saw goes, power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. I think we all know that the energy transition isn't happening quickly enough to meet our climate goals. What I don't think is well understood is why. Why it's still not moving quickly enough and what we need to do to accelerate it. That's what I've come here today to talk to you about. First, let's understand what are not the problems. It's not a lack of awareness. The message that climate change is real and that it's caused by carbon emissions and other greenhouse gases, and that the energy transition is the primary pathway to eliminate them, has been heard. It's understood. Even the policymakers who deny the basic facts in public have heard it, they understand it, and largely they accept it. It's not economics. Study after study has shown that the energy transition will ultimately be cheaper than remaining with the fossil fuel systems on which the world primarily runs today. The absurd cost projections that we used to regularly hear about, 2 decades ago, and especially in the popular press, about how many trillions of dollars the transition would cost and how much more expensive it would be relative to the oil, gas, and coal systems on which things ran, are really no longer a useful way for opponents to attack the energy transition, but primarily because fossil fuels are now a lot more expensive and renewable energy is now a lot cheaper than it was 2 decades ago. So the market effectively buried that argument, albeit with a bit of public support in the form of subsidies and incentives initially. However, many of those technologies, including solar and onshore wind, are now able to compete very successfully unsubsidized against fossil fuels. And indeed, it is the legacy energy sources, fossil fuels and nuclear, that can't live without subsidies now. And the gap between renewables and fossil fuels is only expected to increase. This is why I wrote an article a decade ago saying that the energy transition was unstoppable. Yesterday, the IEA said so too. So it was evident a decade ago for anyone who cared to look, and it's quite obvious now. It's not for a lack of insight about the other virtues of the energy transition. Policymakers have heard the potential for just transitions to address numerous social problems, to provide more equity for disadvantaged classes, to stop the ecological damage done by our fossil fueled systems. Certainly, there's plenty of opportunity to make local officials more aware of specific benefits that their communities could enjoy. But broadly, those messages have gotten out there. In fact, they're increasingly prominent in every COP meeting now. It's not concerns about reliability anymore. A couple decades ago, we used to hear a lot of scare stories. Those too have been proven wrong. Some anti-transition propagandists have successfully confused some policymakers and citizens by filling their heads with false claims about how, for example, the power grid will collapse when it gets to 10% variable renewables, and other such nonsense. But for the most part, those arguments are also losing their power because, again, reality just simply ran them over. Today, many power grids have 20, 30, 40% renewables on their systems, and those systems actually became more reliable in the process. Some systems even have a few hours here and there when they can meet more than 100% of their demand with variable renewables. To date, I'm not aware of even one example of a power grid experiencing a blackout because it had a high share of variable renewables. Never happened. Those are always bad faith arguments, and I think most policymakers who genuinely want to know if renewables are reliable now know that they are. And here's the big one. It's not for a lack of technologies. Most climate models still have solutions, especially for specific hard to decarbonize sectors, especially industrial ones. But we already know that we can decarbonize around 80% more or less of global energy system with technologies that are commercial and off the shelf and viable today. Without some of the more recent exotic technologies like SMRs or CCS or long duration storage. Those who insist that we must worry about how we're going to meet the last 20% of demand now would do well to remember that we have to get to 80% first, and there's a lot of work to do to get to an 80% decarbonized system in the meantime. And personally, I expect the potential solution set will look quite a bit different and cost a lot less once we get to that 80% mark than anyone can imagine today. So I think obsessive modeling today about exactly what that specific mix of technologies and their cost will be to meet that final 20% some decades from now is probably of dubious analytical value. The point is, by and large, we already have basically all the technologies we need. We don't need to wait for more R&D before moving ahead. The technological watchword now is deploy, deploy, deploy. And to the extent that policymakers are not actively working to accelerate that deployment, the reasons they're not doing so are not that they think we need to wait for novel technologies. In short, the issues that are not the actual problems impeding the energy transition are the very ones that I think most researchers imagine they are tackling. So why are policymakers not actively working to accelerate the energy transition and end the combustion of fossil fuels, as everyone agrees we must do? And does our work as energy researchers and advocates effectively address their recalcitrance? To the first question, the answer, I'm afraid, is as banal as it can be. The reason why some policymakers are not actively working to accelerate the energy transition and end the combustion of fossil fuels is because they stand to lose money and power. And because the people in their social circles, the people they know from their country clubs, their professional organizations, neighborhoods, and churches also stand to lose money and power. Wealth, power, and culture. The same old reasons that have bedeviled any sort of progressive politics for the whole of human history. It's just how the world works. But you don't have to take my word for it. Consider the perspective of Gus Speth, a longtime lawyer, author, environmental activist, and co-founder of the National Resources Defense Council, a major U.S. environmental NGO. He graduated summa cum laude from Yale University, attended college here in Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, graduated from Yale Law School. Served as a law clerk to a U.S. Supreme Court Justice. He served as chairman of the Council on Environmental Quality in the Executive Office of the President, where he had overall responsibility for developing and coordinating the President's environmental program. He also co-founded the World Resources Institute, a well-known Washington, D.C. based environmental think tank. He was senior advisor to President Bill Clinton on natural resources, energy, and the environment. He has managed the United Nations Development Assistance Plan and also served as the chair of the United Nations Sustainable Development Group. And that's just a few highlights of a long and illustrious career in the halls of power. In short, he's a guy who understands how the world works. In a recent interview, he said this, quote, "I used to think the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss." Sorry, lost my place here. There we go. Biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that 30 years of good science could address these problems. I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. Or consider the perspective of U.S. vaccine and public health expert Peter Hotez, who's regularly appeared on television news programs in the U.S. over the past several years to explain to the public the latest science on COVID vaccines. In a recent interview, he said that the health sector and the scientific sector don't quite know what to do about the spread of anti-vax information because the attacks on them are politically driven, coming from extremist elements of the Republican Party. He said, quote, "What you see instead are responses that skirt around the edges. You'll see public health agencies step up their pro-vaccine messages, and sure, that's important, but it doesn't get to what's really driving this." He offered several reasons for scientific organizations' ineffective response to the spread of scientific misinformation and disinformation. First, he reinforced what Gus Speth said. They don't have the skill set or the spread or the background for how to deal with it. But second, Hotez noted that the scientific organizations have a traditional commitment to political neutrality. They say, quote, "We're a scientific or health organization. We have to be politically neutral." And he cited the observation by Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel that, quote, "Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim." Although Hotez is obviously in a very different domain than energy, in many respects, he is combating the same people who use the same tactics to spread disinformation and doubt, and that he has arrived at largely the same conclusions as Gus Speth. We should bear that in mind if we want to understand the size and the scope of our opposition. So here's where we are with the energy transition today. The fossil fuel industry has rigged the system every system in the world in every possible way they can. They have their hands on the levers of power everywhere. They influence politicians, media, banking, business, and really the entire world. They are the largest, wealthiest, and most powerful lobby in the world. They have captured legislators and regulators at every level of our institutions. They've funded think tanks to push their ideology for decades, and they've placed their agents everywhere, from the lowest to the very highest seats in government. And as has now been well documented, they've spent about 60 years in a deliberate campaign to confuse and distract the public and undermine the energy transition because it challenges their business, their money, and their power. They have tens of thousands of very well-paid and highly skilled agents and lobbyists working on their behalf every day to corrupt our political, cultural, and social institutions however they can, the world over, to block the energy transition. They literally own essentially the entire right-wing political establishment in the US. Even the junior politicians who may not receive that much money directly from the fossil fuel industry dare not cross the senior officials who do. And though I'm not expert enough to say so definitively, it certainly looks like they own the right-wing politicians the world over, including here in the UK. They are ruthless, they are cutthroat, they have no shame, and they do not believe in fair play. And what sort of resistance are we, the researchers and advocates trying to advance the energy transition, mobilizing against this mighty foe? We publish a handful of research papers in journals that only other academics read, and a few occasional articles in the press, and we hope for the best. That's about it. It's like a child picking up a sword for the first time and going up against a battle-hardened battalion of medieval warriors. Asymmetric doesn't begin to describe this warfare. It's absurd. We're outnumbered, outgunned, and outfunded, 10,000 to 1. And so the answer to my second question, does our work as energy researchers and advocates effectively address the recalcitrance of policymakers to advance the energy transition? The answer is a resounding no. We have no lobbyists, no highly skilled and well-paid communications professionals getting our solutions out there and making sure that policymakers hear them. We get no airtime on the Sunday news shows, at least in the US. I don't know what the equivalent is here. We get no ads placed on TV, no radio spots telling the public millions of times how great our solutions are and how much better a post-energy transition world will be for everyone than staying on the current fossil fuel path. The renewable power industry does not donate hundreds of millions of dollars to politicians to make sure they carry our banner and advance our policies. We do not own entire political parties. And most importantly of all, we don't know how to fight and win. Where they are ruthless, we are ruthful and truthful, and we're all but powerless. As a result, it is the fossil fuel incumbency who defines the debates and frames the issues and gets all the airtime and chooses the decision makers. So here's my challenge to anyone who's doing research in support of the energy transition. Learn how to fight, learn how to win. And if you imagine that by getting your latest paper published in a respective journal, you've made a difference and contributed to the energy transition, I have bad news for you. You haven't. And if you imagine that there's a legion of political staffers and think tankers out there just waiting to convert your brilliant insights into policy, I have more bad news for you. There isn't. And if you imagine the policymakers in the media are eagerly watching the journals, just waiting for the opportunity to discover and amplify your insights, that's right, they aren't. All of these people are just trying to survive another day in their own battles. Like everybody else, they're tired, they're stressed out, they're short on time and attention, running from one urgent demand to the next and just muddling through and doing their best. They have exactly zero time to go explore the journals and discover your brilliant work, and then go fight to turn it into policy. In short, if we want our work to be policy relevant and to advance the energy transition, we're the ones who have to make it so. No one else is going to do it. This past week offered a terrific case in point of exactly what I'm talking about here. I'm sure you've all seen the story, and I won't dwell on the details, but very briefly, the National Infrastructure Commission, the UK's infrastructure watchdog, issued a report with an unambiguous finding. Hydrogen is not suitable for heating homes. It said, quote, the Commission's analysis demonstrates that there is no public policy case for hydrogen to be used to heat individual buildings. It should be ruled out as an option to enable an exclusive focus on switching to electrified heat. On a recent episode of my podcast, I said that using hydrogen to fuel a boiler is like using champagne to flush a toilet. In fact, the NIC's report said that heat pumps are the best and only viable option for low carbon heating in the UK. And how did the UK government respond to this absolutely clear and unambiguous finding of its own infrastructure agency? It said it would continue to back the prospect of using hydrogen for home heating. I had a conversation with an old colleague in the US last week along similar lines. We had worked together on accelerating the deployment of high-speed public charging infrastructure for electric vehicles in the US. And he was decrying the decision by the Biden administration to hand out $7 billion for these new hydrogen hubs, including hydrogen made from natural gas, which no serious climate campaigner would endorse, to be used for all sorts of things, including hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, which no serious transportation transition advocate would endorse, including those working in the US government. So why on earth would they do that, he wondered, when every serious analyst has told them repeatedly that it's a bad idea? The answer in both cases is that our leaders don't make decisions based on how to proceed with our energy systems on the basis of dispassionate, neutral, scientific analysis. There's no team of technocrats going, right, let's understand the problem and then come up with the perfect scientifically sound solutions and go build those. Literally none of our decisions are made this way. In the latter case, we wound up with the decision largely because Joe Manchin, a senator, supported it, and as a result of his particular role in the Senate and the financial interests of himself and his backers and constituents and his authority. In the former case, well, I don't know, but it seems pretty clear that Mr. Sunak is about as much of a champion of the energy transition as Donald Trump. It's all about politics and money. That's literally how all of our decisions are made. But you wouldn't know it from watching the activities of the Academy. So here's what I believe we need to do. First, as a general matter, we have to shake off a few bad habits and unhelpful tendencies. We have to start grappling with the real world and create a clear battle plan for how we're going to make change, specifying what, who, where, when, and how. We have to stop focusing so much on glamorous technologies, especially the ones that aren't yet commercial, and start working on what Marie-Claire Bourgeois of the University of Sussex described as unglamorous solutions in episode 196 of the podcast. Not hydrogen and next generation nukes and hypercars, but wall cavity insulation, wider sidewalks, and protected pavements for pedestrians and bicyclists. We have to find ways to advocate for the critical solutions that have no natural champions in industry, that have no easily concentrated stream of profits that could go into the hands of one company who can then spend those profits to advertising, or the political leadership, and then build that advocacy into our institutional decision-making in an enduring way. We have to stop leaving the dirty business of regulation and policy formation to someone else and start assuming responsibility for it. What if having a battle plan to make one's research policy relevant were a requirement for PhD eligibility? We have to deliberately center distributed customer-owned technologies and just transition objectives in our work. They have to lead our solution pathways, not just get bolted on afterwards as kind of an afterthought to tick a box. And we have to drop the insistence on scientific neutrality. Remember Wiesel's admonition that neutrality helps the oppressor, not the victim. Our opponents in the fossil fuel industry absolutely love our commitment to neutrality because they exploit it mercilessly. They have no such compunction. So essentially, we're fighting with one hand tied behind our backs just because mentally we're living in an alternate universe. If you want your ideas to be taken up in the real world, they have to be delivered in a way that's clear, concise, simple, and with unambiguous intent. So second, we have to learn how to fight. More specifically, we have to learn how to play the games of media, promotion, and lobbying. These are skills, and they can be taught. As I mentioned, the fossil fuel industry pays tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of highly skilled people, both directly and indirectly, to spread carefully crafted lies and convert their desires into public perception and policy. We have to get equipped to combat that. Universities should be employing much larger staffs to work the media, get coverage of their researchers' work, and to get their solutions and their suggestions in front of appropriate staff of legislators, just as the fossil fuel industry lobbyists do. It's a ground game, and one that takes sustained effort, years, even decades of sustained effort, in support of clearly defined objectives. There ought to be a media staffer assigned to promote the work of every single paper that even has a hope of being policy relevant. And if a paper has no hope of being policy relevant, maybe we need to rethink what sort of research we're really doing here. But employing a small army of media and communications professionals isn't enough. We have to train our researchers to advocate for their own work. In my work at several think tanks, and again, this is my 7th career, so I've taken a long and winding path through for-profit companies and NGOs and independent work. I leveraged my prior experience as an independent journalist to develop a little media package to go along with every report I produced. After finishing the report and writing the executive summary, I would then write a one-page version, and then a one-paragraph version, a one-sentence version, multiple versions of 140 characters that could be used to promote it on social media. Then a press release and a cover letter with a media promotion package where I would customize for every single journalist I sent it to. Here's the bullet points that I think you can highlight in your coverage of my report. I assumed that none of them would ever read my reports or even the executive summary, and in fact, many of them never did. But if I gave them a convenient package that they could quickly rewrite into a 500-word article, they would do that, because sadly, that's the reality for many journalists today. I didn't rely on our communications folks to do any of this because A, they didn't have the domain knowledge, B, they didn't have time to do it, and C, really no one expected them to do it. It wasn't their job. And the fact that I did this stuff made me far more effective at getting press coverage for my reports than any of my colleagues. Every single researcher should be formally trained how to do this stuff and be an effective promoter of their own work. But nobody teaches it. I had to figure it out on my own. Training in media promotion and understanding how the world actually works, from regulatory proceedings to policy formation and land planning and on, should be a prerequisite for anyone doing research in this domain. And they should be required to develop a media campaign to promote their work as part of their standard deliverables. Anything short of that, and they might as well not even bother to do the research in the first place, because it won't matter. In addition to serious, thoroughly planned campaigns, we should develop the capacity to intervene quickly and opportunistically. We should develop massive networks of allies who can identify and even create opportunities to get our ideas into the public domain and into policy. Climate campaigners, yes, of course, but also local consumer advocates, people in local media, local councilors who might have a say in the next bit of energy infrastructure to be built in their area. They should know who to call and when they need an expert witness to show up at a hearing tomorrow. They should know who to call when they need a quote for their article on Deadline this afternoon. We should also develop connections with people who are well placed to effectuate the cultural and spiritual transformation that Gus Speth believes is needed. That's a bit beyond the scope of my remarks today, but it means connecting with faith leaders, artists, athletes, celebrities, and influencers of all stripes. Third, we need to get bolder, a lot bolder. Most academics go to great lengths to avoid incurring criticism by caveating everything they say, acknowledging the validity of the views of their critics or other people who disagree with them, and couching their views in the most anodyne language. But that's not how our opponents operate, and it's no way to make a headline. Nobody's ever going to write a headline like, researchers advise caution around investing in fuel cell vehicles for certain vehicle classes and certain kinds of freight movement over the next 15 years. They will, however, be quite willing to write a headline like, hydrogen for transportation is dead and a dumb idea, researchers say. It's also generally a bad idea to even repeat the arguments and framings of your opponents. If this is not a familiar concept, go read some George Lakoff, professor at University of California, Berkeley. Just say what you have to say in the most direct, unambiguous, and forceful way you can muster. You will catch some flack, but as the military saying goes, war is hell and combat's a bitch. No war was ever won by people who never exposed themselves to getting shot. And make no mistake, this is war. And your opponents do not fight fairly. You do no favors for yourself or the project of energy transition by playing it safe. Now, I've been on the receiving end of unfettered criticism from industry and the public alike in my roughly 2 decades of being in the public eye, of publishing my opinions and my research on energy. I've been as exposed as one can be, both in the bad old days of when people read the comments and throughout the years of Twitter and other social media. I know it's not fun to come in for criticism, especially from your peers, but it's not lethal. You will survive. And hopefully you'll have someone around to teach you some skills for dealing with all that as well. But hopefully your institution will back you as well, instead of just withering under the slightest whiff of criticism. And ultimately, as Nietzsche observed, that which does not kill us makes us stronger. What battle does for a soldier is what public criticism does for a messenger. It makes you tougher, sharper, and far more effective. Don't fear it, embrace it. Finally, we need to develop a real ground game, and that means expanding our networks with the explicit intent of disseminating our messages and turning them into policy. Effectively, we all need to become lobbyists. We need to identify people who make the decisions that could turn our ideas into policy and court relationships, not just with them, but with their staff, their media people, and their networks. We should become insiders. Learn to play golf if you have to. Ingratiate. I'm not even kidding. Ingratiate yourselves into the country club set, or make a good friend who is. We should get to the point where no political decision ever surprises us because we already knew it was coming. We should be regularly refreshing our connections with the people who matter, making sure that we're staying on their radar, that they know what we want, and that they're in some way or another working to help make our ideas real. I know, nobody likes networking, but it's critically important to do if you actually want to win. Nobody's looking for you. Nobody's looking for your research. If you want to change the world, you have to get out there and wear out some shoe leather and make it happen. Most people who have been involved in agitating for action on climate change and the energy transition eventually come to the conclusion that we have all the solutions and the only thing we really lack is political will. I'm going to underline that, political will. We have to become expert in politics if we want our expertise in energy to amount to anything. I'll say it again, we must come to grips with the way the world actually works. We have to be able to diagram how the decisions that are relevant to our work are actually made, who the specific people are that make them, and when. We should study those people, get to know them, and develop highly deliberate campaigns to influence them. We should also study our enemies, examine their tactics, and develop counter tactics. And if all that sounds quite distasteful for you, and maybe you have no appetite or aptitude for it, then hire somebody who does. Frankly, given the opposition we face from the fossil fuel industry, what I'm suggesting here is mere table stakes. All of this should be standard practice because it's the only way to win. And we should integrate those studies into our most basic curricula, starting with hiring experienced communications professionals to teach us how to do it. One great idea that came up in the same talk I gave earlier today was hire a few people from the fossil fuel industry who are doing it for them, because they know exactly what the playbook is. We have to get serious about this, or the fossil fueled incumbency will lead us into climate doom. As the old American sports saw goes, winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. Thank you.
Chris, I'm interested, you said we scientists can't lead spiritual, cultural change, but we've also got arts, humanities, anthropologists.
Yeah.
So should we actually be looking to infiltrate through the opera or in art galleries?
100%. I think an opera about climate change would be awesome.
Let's open to questions, please. Nick, you must be the first person to ask a question this afternoon, surely.
No, I think I should say.
Nick was asked to give expert input to the local authority, that is the local government, on climate change issues and so on. So it's an example of practice, knowledge being used to influence and actually deliver useful and guiding policy input rather than having it filtered. So I just think, that's one way of attracting into the policy space.
What I'm talking about. One thing I will say, I've got very bad hearing, so just yell so I can hear you.
Never, I have a banking background, never did I read academic papers in my work working on sustainability.
Right.
So what are some levers to pull there?
How to get the ideas into the private sector?
Yeah.
Well, that's a really good question. It helps if you know some management consultants who have the ear of the right people, and you can feed some of your material to them. It's difficult because the private sector, has their own economic interests in mind. But you can apply the same ideas there in the sense that know what it is that they want, know what it is, the messages that are going to resonate with them, or the things that might be actionable for them, and then develop a custom pitch for them. Give them some very specific ideas. The more specific, the better. But do this, buy that, talk to this person, make this connection, or do some research on that, or whatever it is that you want them to do. But it really comes down to tactics. And so there's no one answer, right?
Maybe somebody who writes books about the energy transition and renewable energy should write them under a pseudonym and have a proponent which has a much more acceptable public face of normality. I'm just thinking at the moment, the book will say this is why it's all on. So how do you put the detail inside after people have picked it up, bought the book, thinking it's what they want to read, and inserting the information
Yes.
in that book?
It's a crazy idea, but it just might work.
Sorry, I'm just,
Yeah.
This is less of a question and more of a response to the last question, but I have a corporate sustainability background and attended a bunch of energy conferences that would be energy buyers, utilities, service providers. But there were never any scientists or researchers there. I think there are spaces where people are kind of gathering to talk about energy, but these sort of ideas aren't really represented in those spaces. So that could be.
But yeah, as a related point, you've probably seen with respect to climate issues, people like Leonardo DiCaprio and Mark Ruffalo, right? Showing up and getting the message out. That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about there with respect to that. Anyway,
not
Yeah.
picking on the example particularly, but Leonardo DiCaprio flies coach when he's going to go and say something about the climate. I mean, I think to most people, the fact is flying is the challenge. So are there degrees? Are there grade scales here? Or can he never fly again if he really is?
I'm not
course?
really into purity tests. I mean, for me, it's all about what impact can you have.
I'm a student. I'm learning some cool science. I'm not learning how to fight in the way that you're suggesting. How do I start?
Right. So again, I'm calling on the school to give you that help, to deliberately offer some training to you to help you learn how to do this stuff. To the extent that you need to do it on your own without anybody's help, it takes some practice. I taught myself how to do it because I had a job that gave me that latitude. It helps to know some writers and editors who are actively working in the profession, who can give you a few pointers. One of the things that was very helpful for me as an independent journalist was the feedback of editors that I was trying to pitch a story to. And, they would tell me, well, I can take this story or I can't take this story because these reasons. And if you spin it this way, then I can do something with it and so on. So that's helpful experience. So a lot of it's just sort of doing it. Yeah, go ahead.
A quick follow-up, not for you, but for Robin. Is that something that the Zero Institute could do? Okay, kind of getting the researchers across the university equipped with those fighting skills, judo moves or whatever.
Judo moves. I hadn't thought about that. That's brilliant.
Just use the momentum of the others,
think that's right.
whatever.
Sorry. Did you? Okay. Question at the back then, please.
I have a background in politics and media. I like that you're saying that academics need to, first of all, reach out more to journalists and anchors to get their message across, but also that they have to stop trying to repeat the arguments of their opponents and try to have this neutral stance. But unfortunately, a lot of journalists have editors and producers that impose that kind of, well, we have to share both sides of the story, which is what the fossil fuel industry has for so long taken advantage of. So even if you make a connection with the press, which is rather easy to do if you just have an internet connection, how would you then go about convincing them to also heed that advice? That no, you don't necessarily need to now go quote a lobbyist who's saying, oh, the transition can be put off. How do you make sure that they are in line with your approach and your view as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's not easy, and there's always some losses along with some wins, and that's just kind of the way the game is. One thing that I used to do fairly effectively is to try to educate them so that they can get out of that simplistic, both sides type attitude and actually engage their brains and think about, is what this person is saying possibly true, or is that propaganda? And just call it out. If it's propaganda, call it out. If it's obviously not true, or you can quickly present some evidence to show that it's not true, that's usually pretty persuasive because, they don't want to publish something that's wrong. They don't want to be the tools of the fossil fuel industry. And if you can remind them that they're at risk of being the tool of the fossil fuel industry, that tends to get their attention. So yeah, there's a little bit of judo involved.
Can I just ask a question about evidence? Because that implies that science has some kind of primacy over what people think or feel. So is evidence still a strong enough thing, or does it need to be an emotional thing?
I mean, evidence is always important, but I think that the key thing is to get people to think. Get them to actually put their brains to work and go, okay, does this make sense? Is this a complete set of evidence? I mean, it's always the same questions, right? Is this verifiable? Can it be replicated? Can this assertion be falsified? I mean, it's just basic logic, right? And you walk them through it, and sometimes that's effective. Not all.
Just, I guess we've had a slight, rebound against the idea that
Right.
facts exist. So,
Right.
sorry.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just wondering if you have an example of a successful academic group employing some of the tactics that you were talking about in terms of media and lobbying. Or semi-successful. Quasi.
I'm almost hesitant to point that out because I feel like if I mention somebody and leave somebody else out, they'll feel slighted. But the first name that came to mind for me is Ben Caldecott. I've known Ben for a while, and so I pay attention to his stuff. But I regularly see his name showing up in the press as someone advocating for the work that his groups do. And I think he's been quite effective at reaching into media and getting coverage. I don't know why.
Thanks for picking someone in this institution rather than elsewhere. Internationally,
Yeah.
anyone else you can pick on North America?
Gosh, well, there are some quite successful researchers at Princeton University and at University of California who have gotten, some of their ideas into the mainstream press, for sure.
Right. We do come to a question from Nick next, please.
Yeah, I'm just going to invite you to take a more positive approach or think about some things that are positive, because I'm active politically as well as being
I'm sorry, I haven't heard that.
active politically as well as being
Okay.
an energy researcher. It does seem to me that things are changing, and most notably, if you look at the power sector, most investment is now going into renewables, not into fossil fuels. So when do we get to the flipping point when the renewables industry are the big, powerful gorillas and the most effective lobbyists, and the fossil fuels are the weak guys who are becoming increasingly irrelevant? I mean, there is an academic concept of lock-in, which describes what you described, but we also know it breaks down at times under some conditions. And I've been working on climate for 35 years. It does seem to me that we are now in the energy transition. The energy transition is something that needs to happen. It's something that is happening. And when does that balance of power shift?
I guess my sort of glib answer would be when the renewable industry starts putting hundreds of millions of dollars into political campaigns. We're not there yet.
We're getting an odd million or so into the next election campaign. More renewable energy.
People ask me, am I optimistic? And I said, of course I'm optimistic. I've been doing this for 20 years, and I started my energy career in the George W. Bush administration. When the U.S. government was literally run by fossil fuel guys. So it's better now than it's been in 20 years, as far as I'm concerned. There's plenty of progress that's been made, but yeah, we still, the world is still 80–90% fossil fuel system, depending on how you want to look at it. So we got ways to go yet. No, please.
Your thesis is that the fossil fuel industry has captured the political system, but the political system tends to be very responsive to public opinion. And around the world, with the possible exception of parts of the United States, there is a growing fear of climate change. There's a belief that action is absolutely right. Politicians generally respond to what they think is the political opinion of the people who vote for them, just as much as the people who fund them. Now, are you sure that the political system isn't actually changing much faster than you're putting forward the idea in response.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can't be sure of that, and if I could, how would I measure it? I don't know.
Well, the speed of the transition, as the IEA was pointing out today, is increasing.
Yeah.
The move towards renewable electricity is, in your words, unstoppable. Are you not being too pessimistic about this? I want to put forward, perhaps can I then just put forward another hypothesis after you respond?
Okay. Again, I don't even know how to measure or characterize this. I guess I would say that the intelligentsia, the folks who are really aware of what's happening in the policy domain, researchers, people who write about this stuff for a living, are certainly aware that the energy transition is happening, that it's accelerating. I'm not sure that the rank and file public is as aware. I think they get a lot more messages from the fossil fuel industry still. I'll give you an example. The fossil fuel industry regularly has ads all over television and radio. We've all seen them talking about all the great things that we get from fossil fuels, right? Have you ever seen a single ad to say the same thing about renewables? Just one. I'm betting no. So we have a long way to go yet to really get to equity or parity with the fossil fuel industry in terms of public awareness. But I think the elites are getting the message. Certainly the corporates are getting the message because it's now becoming, they're getting a lot more pressure to reduce their emissions and to do something. Yeah.
So I'm just going to let a quick follow up and then we'll come to the back next.
Yes, just very quickly. So when you ask people the question around the world, with the exception of the United States, is climate change the most significant problem the world faces? You will get a very large percentage of people accepting it. However, if you make the question more detailed and say, would you be prepared to accept, for example, paying more for your meat or for your car as a result of this concern, you get the interest, the level of concern dies away. And that seems to be the problem. The actions to take climate change are still costly on individual citizens. There's no real prospect of climate justice affecting that. It costs more to buy an electric car, to move away to low carbon food, raises the price of food, and this is true across every single sector. So how are we going to deal with that as a politics?
I'm going to push back on that just a little bit by saying that my study of electric vehicles tells me that a total cost of ownership basis, it's actually cheaper. Even though the vehicle itself might cost twice as much as the internal combustion engine version, the total cost of ownership basis, it's actually cheaper. Overall, renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels. And as the energy transition progresses, I expect that to exert essentially a deflationary effect. So I think that ultimately it will be cheaper for everyone to proceed with the energy transition. The problem, of course, is that there's all this upfront capital and it looks more expensive in the short term. And the opponents of the energy transition make a lot of hay with that point. But really, if you think about it, that's a structured finance problem. You know, that's a problem that Wall Street can solve. But we're not very good at telling that story, and we're not very good at pushing back on that talking point either. So I agree that I think that's mainly a messaging problem. I don't think it's actually an economic problem.
Because there are stories out there now about how much it's costing the delay to deploy more renewable energy, how much it's costing people in terms of not having insulation in their property. So it's being reframed as a cost to the population rather than the investment required.
Exactly.
So just go back there for a second.
I'd like to respond to that. So I think I do know how to quantify how much you care. I do agree. Well, abstractly understand that climate change, global warming is a threat, but they're ignorant. As a young guy who's around young people, I try to talk about this a lot. Ultimately, I think we'll know when we're going in the right direction, when there are more kids in the street. Because there aren't that many. That's
I always get told it's just because it clashes with lectures, but I don't know whether that. Can we just come to this question next, please? Yeah.
I think the situation in Europe is somewhat different from the US. We've mentioned that a couple of times. And on advertising, I see a lot of adverts promoting a very narrow aspect of the transition or renewables, are often put out by traditionally fossil fuel companies such as Exxon or Saudi Aramco or Repsol. And very often they are definitely greenwash. Indeed, Repsol have recently been forced to withdraw an advert about hydrogen by the UK's Advertising Standards Authority because they were basically misleading the public. How do we counter that as well, which is almost where sometimes I think not actually even deliberately misleading them. I think sometimes they believe their own hype. An ex-colleague of yours once said that greenwash is good, but sooner or later people feel they've got to act. But how do we counter that sense of almost greenwashing and also trying to say we're doing something, but we're actually not doing anything fast enough or big enough?
Yeah. It's not easy. You know, I think my standard approach to that problem is to tease it apart, because a lot of times there's some untruths that are wrapped up within a truth, and they kind of sell it as a package. And so if you can take that apart a little bit, talk about which parts of it are true and which parts of it are not, then you have a hook. Then you have something you can actually talk about and an idea that you can build on. But it's tricky, you know. Like I said, I mean, these are skills. These are things that professionals know how to do, and that's why I think that we need to somehow bring the knowledge and the skill set of communications professionals to bear on promoting our research and our ideas on energy, especially with the scientific establishment.
There's an attempt in the European Union to control the use of certain terms associated with greenwash so that they're not in the hands of the fossil fuel lobby, but actually making control of language being the method by which you change the communication of the message sounds slightly odd. Anyway, Charlie was next. Then.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering, you tended to characterize the energy transition as being a supply side story about fossil fuels to renewables. I'm curious as to whether you think you see in sort of public or political discourse that the energy transition is also very much about how we use energy. And if you do, I'm wondering if you think scientists have been equally as ineffectual at convincing policy and politicians of that as you have argued that they have been with respect to
absolutely. In fact, that's kind of where I was going with my comments about unblameless solutions. I think we talk far too much about technology and not nearly enough about fundamental ways that our society operates and just the everyday things that we do and the way that demand can be shaped and modified. And this is why I was talking about things like wider sidewalks and protected bike lanes. You know, we don't talk nearly enough about that stuff. I mean, so much we could make so much progress in reducing energy just by having a local insulation project. You know, but that's not a sexy, glamorous technology. It's not the kind of profit stream that can be concentrated by one corporate. And so it doesn't get enough traction. On the demand side, you know, I think there's so many things like that, right? So in transportation, we get people on the bicycles and on the foot traffic instead of in their cars. That's a huge win. For heating, if we could, you know, like this whole conversation about boilers in the UK just drives me insane. You know, we have to get onto heat pumps. It's really the right thing to do. And there's a lot of, you know, confusion being sowed in the public mind about that particular issue. And we can combat that, you know, but yeah, it's a ground game. It's point by point. I don't know if any of you have listened to the Energy Transition Show, and if not, there's over 200 episodes out there. There's a lot of stuff, and you really ought to be listening to it. But I've emphasized repeatedly on the show the role of demand side technologies, as well as supply side stuff. It makes a huge difference, especially in terms of grid management. We recently did an episode on virtual power plants. I've talked a lot about the importance of electricity tariffs in terms of shaping the load of electric vehicles, and how these kinds of demand side technologies can help us actually accommodate the electrification of a lot of things, bringing a lot of fossil fuel loads onto the grid without also causing the requirement for a massive expansion of the transmission and distribution system. And that gets into some deep, dark subjects about grid design, which I've tackled on the show, Geek Rating 10. Yes, we can.
Nick, thank you for being patient.
Not at all, no. It's just specifically on, say, the heat pumps, they're much more efficient, much less energy. But when you talk to somebody and they say, well, this is going to be much cheaper, then actually in the UK, because of our tariff system, it's not. And then, of course, that is a downside. Changing that as a policy thing can make a huge difference, both for EVs and so how do you go about that? Besides, I suppose you use all the techniques you just talked about.
Yeah, I don't have a ready answer for that, but I will mention that there's a news item I came across recently, and there's a news section at the end of every one of my shows, and I talk about some recent events that I think are relevant. And there was two people who live in Cambridgeshire, outside of Cambridge, who, small village, who decided that they were tired of paying such high prices for fuel oil because they don't have gas mains there, and so they're all running these little oil-fired boilers. And so they put together a whole program. They rounded up 12 million pounds debt and equity and loans and so on, and they basically installed a district heating network for their little village. Now the cost was sort of absurd to start, but ultimately they're going to be able to expand that system and stretch it out, and everyone's going to benefit. And they're ultimately, I think the consumer is going to be paying less over time. But people don't know about these things, right? So we really need to educate them what these other ways of doing things are, and how it's going to make their lives better, and how it's ultimately going to be cheaper. And we have to educate the council people who are going to support those ideas and help make those projects happen. But I think it's very hopeful that just two motivated citizens are able to make change like that in a small village in Cambridgeshire, right? So there's a lot of stories out there that I think are fascinating. One of the things that I've been doing, right now I'm on a 3-month research trip across the UK, and I spent the first month of it going around Scotland. And one of the main objectives I had was to tell a story about the tiny Scottish island of Egg, which some of you have heard about, but they've done their own fascinating little energy transition. It's like the energy transition in a snow globe, and it's just a great little story. So I went there and I interviewed people, and I'm going to produce a show about that. Because I figure, if a small group of people on a little island in the Hebrides can do that, who can't, really? So a lot of it comes down to just kind of getting the ideas out there and inspiring people with a vision that they can understand. And that's an important antidote to the pushback that the fossil fuel industry or even the boiler manufacturers are pushing on people, because they are pushing the false ideas on people.
I'm going to suggest, since that's a positive note, maybe we'll finish the formal question session. If you'd be okay to hang around for a minute, I need to do a quick advert for next week. Is that okay? First of all,
and also after this, anybody who wants to join me at the pints at the King's Arms, please do. All right.
So it remains for us to say thank you very much indeed to Chris Nelder for coming to join us today. For next week, I unfortunately cannot join the talk from Chris Llewellyn-Smith, who will be talking about the Royal Society report on large storage. But your host will be Paul Shearing, who is director of the Zero Institute. And I hope as many of you as possible can make it either in person or online. But thanks very much for joining us.